The economic philosophy of black nationalism only means that we should own and operate and control the economy of our community. The economic philosophy of black nationalism shows our people the importance of setting up these little stores and developing them and expanding them to large operations. So our people not only have to be re-educated to the importance of supporting black businesses, but the black man himself has to be made aware of the importance of going into business. And once you and I go into business, we own and operate at least the businesses in our community. What we will be doing is developing a situation wherein we will actually be able to create employment for the people in the community. If we own the stores, if we operate the businesses, if we try and establish some industry in our own community, then we're developing the position where we are creating employment for our kind. Malcolm X, The Ballad of the Bullet Speech, April 3rd, 1964. Hey guys, this is Dawson Discussions. My name is Nathan O. Dawson Jr., your host. Today's date is May 4th, 2021. In this video, I will talk about the history of black entrepreneurship in the United States of America. As a disclaimer, I do fully support a black economic empowerment plan for the Native non-Hispanic black American community because of the effects of slavery, Jim Crow, and the current black racial political policy of benign neglect that is being practiced since the early 1970s. In May 2019, former President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 13872, which is an executive order for the economic empowerment of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Because of the current political and social climate going on against the Native non-Hispanic black Americans through benign neglect, an economic empowerment legislation or an executive order similar to Executive Order 13872 will not happen in the near future for Native non-Hispanic black Americans. So again, this video is actually me talking about the history of black entrepreneurship in the United States of America. So stay tuned. Oxford Dictionary defines entrepreneurship as the activity of setting up a business or businesses, taking on financial risk in the hope of profit. Merriam-Webster defines entrepreneurship as one who organizes, manages, and assumes the risk of a business or enterprise. Dictionary.com defines entrepreneurship as the act of organizing and managing any enterprise, especially a business, usually with considerable initiative and risk. So the most common word in all three dictionaries are business and risk. So a business is essentially the activity of making one's living or making money by producing or buying and selling products, such as goods and services for a profit. But a risk, in the simplest terms, the word risk means the possibility of something bad happening. Risk arises from uncertainty about the profit of a commercial business due to unwanted events such as changes in taste, change of preferences of consumers, strikes, increased competition, changes in governmental policy, and obsolescence, and etc. Business risks are controlled using techniques of risk management. In many cases, they may be managed by intuitive steps to prevent or mitigate risk by following regulations or standards of good practice or by insurance. So essentially, I define entrepreneurship as a process of starting and managing a business entity that provides innovation and value to the market, while at the same time mitigating the risk associated with pursuing a profit. So Tiffany Howard of University of Nevada, Las Vegas, a political science professor and recent Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Senior Research Fellow, she said that there are many advantages of entrepreneurship, one of them being it promotes substantial economic growth. Howard also says, according to a recent survey of the business owners, the existing number of black-owned businesses have created over 1 million jobs and generated over $165 billion in revenue. Another important advantage of entrepreneurship is that successful business ownership is one mode of achieving personal wealth. The wealth differential between business owners and non-business owners is significant, and this wealth advantage is even more pronounced for black people. Howard also then says that the median net worth for black business owners is 12 times higher than that of black non-business owners. Further, when examining the net worth of black business owners in comparison to the net worth of white business owners, it becomes clear that entrepreneurship represents a pathway to narrowing the racial wealth gap in the United States of America. While white people have 13 times the wealth of African Americans, when compared to the median wealth of black and white business owners, the median wealth gap decreases substantially. Still, despite this, black entrepreneurs make up just 3.5% of all business owners in the United States of America. The researchers believe that a part of this is due to poor financial literacy, while 82% of those African Americans who were surveyed lack knowledge of things such as the credit score or the state agencies designed to help them start their small businesses. Without this knowledge, it's difficult to raise a startup capital to get a business going. While this isn't a problem unique to the black youth, the researchers do nonetheless believe financial literacy does lag behind whites. This lack of black business ownership or black entrepreneurship has a profound impact on black communities, especially in sectors such as food and beverage, where food insecurity and food deserts are still an unwelcome presence in many black communities. The prevalence of fast food outlets and such food deserts exacerbates many of the health problems highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, African Americans have a long and rich history of entrepreneurship. Within 2 decades of the abolition of slavery, African Americans established several thousand successful businesses that derived in exclusively African American communities. So, according to my mother, my great-grandfather, my mom's paternal side, was a businessman in Louisiana, and he owned 2 stores. Also, my great-aunt, or my dad's mother's sister, also, I think at one point she owned, or maybe she still do own, a small business in the floral industry. Floral meaning she deal with flowers. So essentially, entrepreneurship runs in my family, at least. So African Americans have operated virtually every kind of company, but some of the most prominent black-owned businesses have been insurance companies, banks, record labels, funeral parlors, barbershops, beauty salons, restaurants, soul food restaurants, record stores, and bookstores. So profit-making businesses were created by more free and enslaved African Americans than one might realize from the usual survey of antebellum America. When the opportunity presented itself, it was taken by these men and women, sometimes timidly, sometimes wholeheartedly, and often endorsed by the masters of the enslaved. Businesses often evolve out of the skills or specialties of the business owner or service provider, such as being a tobacconist. As a young man, Lunsford Lane recalls selling a basket of peaches for money he could keep, and very soon he sets plans for money making to the principal possession of my thoughts. In 6 to 8 years, he amassed $1,000, enough to purchase his freedom, as you can read from the narrative of Lunsford Lane, published in 1842. You also have your shoemakers. William J. Brown was born to a free black family in Rhode Island, and as a young man, he faced discrimination and often unethical treatment from whites as he strove to pursue a trade and career. In his selection from his Life of William J. Brown of Providence, Rhode Island, published in 1883, we read that he had frustrating experiences as a store clerk and apprentice shoemaker. Then you also have sailmakers. James Fortin Sr., a freeman and grandfather to Charlotte Fortin, learned the sailmaking trade after the Revolution, bought his employer's business, and later became the wealthiest black man in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In an 1835 article from the white journal, The Anti-Slavery Record, a white reporter describes a visit to Fortin's sailmaking business. And you also have barbers. After being emancipated by his enslaver in 1820, William Johnson became a successful black businessman in Natchez, Mississippi, operating a barbershop, loaning money, and acquiring real estate. Merchants. Freeborn in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Mifflin Gibbs became a businessman, lawyer, politician, and an abolitionist. For several years, he operated a clothing store in San Francisco, which we learned from his autobiography, Shadow of Light, published in 1902. And also, you have dressmakers. After purchasing her freedom in St. Louis, Missouri, Elizabeth Keckley moved to Washington, D.C. and became the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln. Produced elegant gowns for the capital elite women. Her 1868 autobiography, Behind the Scenes, displayed her ardor and initiative in creating her business and her life. Emancipation and civil rights permitted businessmen to operate inside the American legal structure, starting in the Reconstruction era, from 1863 to 1877 and afterwards. By the 1890s, thousands of small business operations had opened in urban areas. Memphis, Tennessee was the base for Robert Reed Church. Church built a reputation for great wealth and influence in the business community. He founded a solvent savings bank, the first black-owned bank in the city, which extended credits to blacks so they could buy homes and develop their small businesses. As a philanthropist, Church used his wealth to develop a park, playground, auditorium, and other facilities for the black community, who were excluded by state-sanctioned racial segregation from most such amenities in the city. Of course, from the late 1880s, there was a remarkable development of Negro businesses, banks and insurance companies, undertakers, and retail stores. It occurred at a time when Negro barbers, tailors, caterers, tradesmen, blacksmiths, and other artisans were losing their white customers. Depending upon the Negro market, the promoters of the new enterprises naturally upheld the spirit of racial self-help and solidarity. Black communities were undoubtedly negatively affected by the enforcement of racial segregation. In cities and urban areas where blacks were limited to residential areas they could occupy, whether in the South or in the North, segregation limited the social, educational, and economic progress of the varying black communities forced into this racial social practice. However, new economic and anthropological and sensory research conducted established how the black communities in the North during the late 19th century fought against racial segregation by donning new attitudes towards commerce and entrepreneurship. Racial segregation in the North during the late 19th century saw a considerable rise in black entrepreneurship and black-owned small businesses within their respective communities. These small business owners were able to take advantage of constraints placed upon the African American community and exploit a market of untapped black consumers that at that time were not allowed a great deal of purchasing power in white economic markets. This rise in Negro markets, as framed by St. Clair Drake and Horace R. Clayton in Black Metropolis, occurred in the south side of cities like Chicago, where African Americans established a region of their own, where the number of black-owned businesses reached 2,500 by 1937 in Southside Chicago. The most rapid growth came in the early 20th century as the increasingly rigid Jim Crow system of segregation moved urban blacks into a community large enough to support a business establishment. The National Negro Business League, promoted by college president Booker T. Washington, opened over 600 chapters, reaching every city with a significant black population. The National Negro Business League was an American organization founded in Boston in 1900s by Booker T. Washington in order to promote the interests of African American businesses. The mission and main goal of the National Negro Business League was to promote the commercial and financial development of the Negro. It was recognized as composed of Negro men and women who have achieved success along business lines. It grew rapidly with 320 chapters in 1905 and more than 600 chapters in 34 states by 1915. And in 1966, the league was then renamed and reincorporated in Washington, D.C. as the National Business League, which still remains in operation today. Maggie Lena Walker, in 1902, she published a newspaper for the organization, the St. Luke Herald. Shortly after, she chartered the St. Luke Penny Saving Bank. Walker served as the bank's first president, which earned her the recognition of being the first African-American woman to charter a bank in the United States of America. The St. Luke Penny Savings Bank leadership also included several female board members. Later, Walker then agreed to serve as chairman of the board of directors when the bank merged with two other Richmond banks to become the Consolidated Bank and Trust Company, which grew to serve generations of Richmond citizens as an African-American owned institution. By 1920, there were tens of thousands of black businesses, the great majority of them being quite small, but the largest of them were insurance companies. Historian Juliet Walker called the 1900s to the 1930s the golden age of black businesses. According to National Negro Business League, the number of black-owned businesses doubled from 20,000 in 1900 to 40,000 in 1914. There were 450 undertakers in the year 1900, and then it rose to 1,000. Drugstores rose from 250 to 695, almost 700. Local retail merchants, most of them being quite small, jumped from 10,000 to 25,000. So around the start of the 20th century, O.W. Gurley, a wealthy black landowner from Arkansas, came to what was then known as Indian Territory to participate in the Oklahoma Land Run of 1889. The young entrepreneur had just resigned from a presidential appointment under President Grover Cleveland in order to strike out on his own. In 1906, Gurley moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he purchased 40 acres of land, which was only to be sold to colored. Another black entrepreneur was J.B. Stratford, arrived in Tulsa in 1899. He believed that black people had a better chance of economic progress if they pooled their resources, worked together, and supported each other's businesses. He bought large tracts of real estate in the northeastern part of Tulsa, which he had subdivided and sold exclusively to other blacks. Gurley and a number of other blacks soon followed suit. Stratford later built the Stratford Hotel on Greenwood, where blacks would enjoy the amenities of the downtown hotels who served only to whites. It's said to be the largest black-owned hotel in the United States of America. So the Greenwood district in Tulsa became known as Black Wall Street, one of the most commercially successful and affluent majority African American communities in the United States of America. Booker T. Washington himself referred to Greenwood neighborhood as the Negro Wall Street. On Black Wall Street, there were African American attorneys, real estate agents, entrepreneurs, and doctors who offered their services in the neighborhood. But many white residents felt intimidated by the prosperity, growth, and the size of this Black Wall Street. Not only was Greenwood Tulsa expanding in population, but it was also expanding its physical boundaries, which eventually collided with the boundaries of the white neighborhoods. According to several newspapers and articles at the time, there were reports of hateful letters sent to prominent business leaders within the Black Wall Street, which demanded that they stop overstepping their boundaries into the white segregated portion of Tulsa. White residents grew increasingly resentful about the wealth of the Greenwood community. So the Tulsa Race Massacre, also known as the Tulsa Race Riot, or the Greenwood Massacre, or the Black Wall Street Massacre, or the Tulsa Massacre, took place on May 31st and June 1st, 1921. May 31st, 1921 to June 1st, 1921, when mobs of white residents, many of them deputized and given weapons by city officials, attacked black residents and businesses of the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It had been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. The attack, carried out on ground and from private aircraft, destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the district. At that time, which was, again, the wealthiest black community in the United States of America, which was known as Black Wall Street. More than 800 people were admitted to hospitals, and as many as 6,000 black residents were interned in large facilities, many of them for several days. The Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics officially recorded 36 dead. A 2001 commission examination of the events were able to confirm 39 dead, 26 black, and 13 white, based on contemporary autopsy reports and death certificates and other residents. The commission gave several estimates ranging from 75 to 300 dead. So essentially, the massacre began on Memorial Day weekend after 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a black shoe shiner, was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white elevator operator of the nearby Drexel building. He was taken to custody. After the arrest, rumors spread throughout the city that Rowland was to be lynched. Upon hearing reports that a mob of hundreds of white men gathered around the jail where Rowland was being kept, a group of 75 black men, some of them were armed, arrived at the jail to ensure that Rowland would not be lynched. The sheriff persuaded the group to leave the jail, assuring that he had the situation well under control. As the group was leaving the premises, complying with the sheriff's request, a member of the mob of white men allegedly attempted to disarm one of the black men. A shot was fired, and then, according to the reports of the sheriff, all hell then broke loose. At the end of the firefight, 12 people were killed, 10 white and 2 black. As news of these deaths spread throughout the city, mob violence exploded. White rioters rampaged through the black neighborhood that night and morning, killing men and burning and looting stores and homes. Around noon on June 1st, 1921, the Oklahoma National Guard imposed martial law, effectively ending the massacre. Essentially, Jackson Ward is a historically African American district in Richmond, Virginia, with a long tradition of African American businesses. It is located less than a mile from the Virginia state capital, sitting to the west of the Court Inn and north of Broad Street. Currently, it is listed as a National Historic Landmark District since 1978. So after the American Civil War, previously free blacks joined free slaves and their descendants and created a thriving African American business community and became known as the Black Wall Street of America. Leaders included such influential people such as John Mitchell Jr., editor of Richmond Planet, an African American newspaper company, or an African American newspaper brand, and also Maggie L. Walker. Miss Walker was the first woman to charter and serve as president of a American bank. All the more remarkable accomplishment as she was both African American and was mobility impaired. The Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site at her former Jackson Ward home is operated by the National Park Service. The house was designated as a National Historic Site in 1978 and opened as a museum in 1985. As a center for both black commerce and entertainment, Jackson Ward was also the Harlem of the South. Venues along the Deuce or 2nd Street, such as the Hippodrome Theater, were frequently by the likes of Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Bill Bojangles Robinson, Lena Horne, Cab Calloway, Billie Holiday, Nat King Cole, James Brown, and other Chitlin circuit performers. Today, a statue of Robinson dancing on the staircase is at the center of the neighborhood at the intersection of Chamberlain Parkway and Westlake. Haitai, or the Haitai District, is a historic African American community that is now part of the city of Durham, North Carolina. It was founded as an independent black community shortly after the American Civil War on the southern edge of Durham by freedmen coming to work in tobacco warehouses and related jobs in the city. By the early decades of the 20th century, African Americans owned and operated more than 200 businesses, which were located along Fayetteville, Pettigrew, and Pine Streets, the boundaries of Haitai. The neighborhood continued to develop during the late 19th and early 20th centuries through years of racial segregation imposed by white Democrats in the state legislature following the Reconstruction era in the South. With the black-owned businesses and services, a library, a hotel, a theater, a hospital, the community became self-sufficient. It declined in the late 20th century due to suburbanization, which drew some residents to newer housing outside the area. In the late 1800s, residents would establish all the landmarks of a thriving community. These included local businesses, schools, and a congregation which eventually built the St. Joseph African Methodist Episcopal. Also, at the end of the century, one of the founders of the community, James E. Shepard, joined John Merrick to form the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. At the time, the company was first black-owned life insurance company. Black business owners would hire locals, thus providing for a local economy that is black-owned and black-operated. In the year 1900, Lincoln Hospital was erected, and the city was essentially a separate of Durham, even if it was recognized as such. With these successes, the community was visited by rival academics. Booker T. Washington and Webb Du Bois would visit and point the city as an example, which is the peak, an example of peak community building stability. So in the early 20th century, Haitai would become the home of North Carolina Central University, founded by James Shepard. The institution was the first black liberal arts college to receive state backing. And now the decline of Haitai. Largely black self-sufficient neighborhoods often met their ends either in a race riot or by political power. The latter was true of Haitai, as black citizens didn't have the numbers or voices in power. By the 1950s, infrastructure improvements were bustling through the U.S. As a result, Durham engaged in urban renewal, which gouged out chunks of the community. With these parts of the community gone, many of the black residents moved elsewhere. Today, Haitai is a historical district that produced many celebrities and influential people, such as gospel singer Shirley Caesar, comedian Pygmy Markham, and pro football player and painter Ernie Barnes, just to name a few. So this small black community was responsible for some of the Nationals first. It was the first all African American community to be fully self sufficient. By the early 20th century, it had its own schools, libraries, churches, barbershops, the Lincoln Hospital in the year 1900, a movie theater, recreation center, and hotels. The North Carolina Central University, a historically black college, was established in the year 1910 by James E. Shepard as a private religious school. By 1925, it became the first African American liberal arts college in the United States of America to be state funded, when the state legislature made it part of the state system. Which then leads me to the Black Wall Street of Durham, North Carolina, during the late 1800s and early 1900s. This one was located on Paris Street. It was home to the Farmers and the Mechanics and Farmers Bank and North Carolina Mutual. John Merrick and Charles Spalding, this duo provided leadership and an initiative necessarily for the beginnings of this Black Wall Street. Although able to include African American wealth, the main Black Wall Street did not distribute this new wealth equally within Durham's black community, Haitai. So the region also promoted basic social reconstructing for blacks, but did not contribute to desegregation efforts. So during the early 20th century, and despite Jim Crow era regulations across North Carolina and the South, black-owned businesses thrived in downtown Durham. In 1906, the country's largest and oldest black-owned insurance company, North Carolina Mutual Life, moved its headquarters to Paris Street. A year later, Merrick, Richard Fitzgerald, and other local businessmen founded the country's first African-American bank, Mechanics and Farmers in Durham, and helped fund the growth of local businesses and ventures. In a census conducted in 1905, it was estimated that 75% of revenue for Paris Street businesses resulted from those investments. Both financial institutions continue to operate from Durham today. Back then, Paris Street comprised of it was a four-block district located adjacent to the city's main street. And while other similar districts evolved in other cities as well, Durham was known nationally for its cultivations of black entrepreneurism. And by the 1950s, Paris Street was being called the Black Wall Street. Between 1890 and 1910, Durham saw a 200% increase in population of black residents. And by 1920, black-owned businesses and property totaled more than 400 million, which will probably about 51 million in 2020 dollars, adjusted for inflation. A residential neighborhood called Haitai, again, grew up nearby, and the black and white community alike were served by the Paris Street-based barbers, tailors, printers, masons, physicians, lawyers, newspapers, periodicals, plus the Blue City Drug Company. Durham then continued to grow and was known broadly as the capital of the black middle class in America during the mid-20th century. Authors Booker T. Washington and Webb Du Bois celebrated the economic situation of blacks in the city through their letters and writing. By the time of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, urban sprawl and desegregation had pushed Paris Street past its economic heyday. However, the influence of those early black-owned businesses still persists even today. Harlem. Harlem is a neighborhood in Upper Manhattan, New York City, New York State. Harlem was predominantly occupied by Jewish and Italian Americans in the 19th century, but African American residents began to arrive in large numbers during the Great Migration in the 20th century. In the 1920s and the 1930s, Central and West Harlem were the center of the Harlem Renaissance, a major African American cultural movement. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual and cultural revival of African American music, dance, art, fashion, literature, theaters, and politics centered in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City, New York State, spanning the 1920s and the 1930s. At that time, it was called the New Negro Movement, named after the New Negro, a 1925 anthology edited by Elaine Locke. The movement also included the new African American cultural expressions across the urban areas in the Northeast and the Midwest United States, affected by a renewed militancy and a general struggle for civil rights for African Americans that occurred in the wake of the civil rights struggles in the then still segregated United States Armed Forces in World War I, in which was further inspired by the NAACP, the Garveyite movement, and the Russian Revolution, combined with the Great Migration of African American workers fleeing the racist conditions of the Jim Crow Deep South. Harlem then became the final destination of the largest number of those who migrated north. Though it was centered in the Harlem neighborhood, many Francophone or those black writers from from African and Caribbean colonies who lived in Paris were also influenced by the movement, which spanned from about 1918 until the mid-1930s. Many of these ideas live on much longer. The zenith of this flowering of Negro literature, as James Weldon Johnson preferred to call the Harlem Renaissance, took place between 1924, when Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, hosted a party for black writers where many white publishers were also in attendance. And in 1929, the year of the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, the Harlem Renaissance is considered to be a rebirth of African American arts. Many people would argue that the Harlem Renaissance never ended and has continued to be an important cultural force in the United States through the decades, from the age of the stride piano, jazz, and blues to the ages of bebop, rock and roll, soul, disco, and even hip hop. So most of the African Americans in business were men. However, women did play a major role, especially in the area of beauty. The most famous entrepreneur in beauty was Madam C.J. Walker. She built a national franchise business called Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company based on her invention of the first successful hair straightening process. Marjorie Joyner was the first black graduate of a beauty school in Chicago, where she got to know Madam C.J. Walker and became her agent. In addition to the more prominent businesses that I mentioned earlier, African Americans have strong to their traditions of owning and operating small businesses such as restaurants, drugstores, newsstands, corner stores, bodegas, candy shops, candy stores, liquor stores, grocery stores, bars, and gas stations. African Americans have a length of history of ownership in music-related businesses, including record stores, nightclubs, and record labels. And also there's a term called double duty dollar. Double duty dollar was used in the United States from the early 1900s through the early 1960s to express the notion that dollars spent with the businesses hiring blacks simultaneously purchase a commodity and advance the race. Where the concept applied, retailers who exclude African Americans as employees effectively excluded them as patrons too. So again, like how I alluded to earlier, the term double duty dollar was used in the United States from the early 1900s to early 1960s in order to express the notion that dollars spent with businesses that hired African Americans simultaneously purchased a commodity and advanced the race. So where that concept applied, it was believed that the retailers that exclude African Americans as employees should be shunned by the black community. Essentially, the slogan was popularized by Virginia Union University University professor Gordon B. Hancock. Numerous ministers and activists such as Booker T. Washington and Marcus M. Garvey urged the black community to redirect their dollars from retailers and services to refuse to hire African Americans to those who did hire them. While these initiatives inspired by the concept to continue to exist, the strategy has also been applied by others for different but for similar reasons. So essentially, in the 1940s and the 1950s, Leon Sullivan applied the broader phrase selective patronage to denote consumer choice of retailers as a tool to both influence businesses towards having more and fair, non-discriminatory interactions with African Americans and to build demand for African American businesses. Black entrepreneurship entered the national agenda in 1927 when Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, who then became president in 1929 to 1933, He set up a division of Negro affairs to provide advice and disseminate information to both white and black businessmen on how to reach the black consumer. Entrepreneurship was not on the New Deal agenda after 1933. However, when Washington turned to war preparation in 1940, the Division of Negro Affairs tried to help black businesses secure defense contracts. Black businesses were not oriented towards manufacturing in the first place and generally were too small to secure any major contracts. President Dwight D. Eisenhower disbanded the agency in 1953. With the civil rights movement at full blast, Lyndon B. Johnson coupled black entrepreneurship with his war on poverty, setting up a special program in the Small Business Administration, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and all of the agencies. This means, this time there was money for loans designed to boost black business ownership. President Richard M. Nixon greatly expanded the program, setting up the Office of Minority Business Enterprise, OMBE, in expectation that black entrepreneurs would help defuse racial tensions and possibly support his reelection. And of course, in the recent months or the recent years, this current pandemic has been a factor in black-owned businesses and how they are performing during this time period. A research study conducted by the Federal Reserve has found out that black-owned businesses has been hit the hardest in the pandemic than others because of their geography, limited reach to key federal aid programs, and weaker ties to banks. They found that counties with high concentrations of black-owned businesses also had a high amount of COVID-19 cases. Meanwhile, counties with higher shares of white-owned businesses had a lower incidence of COVID-19 cases. The result of this is the direct and longer forced closure because of the symptoms, and indirect, which is the social distancing and much fewer customers, changes on the black-owned businesses. So the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP, which had $670 billion in loans to help small businesses, saw less volume of their loans go through the program to high concentrated areas of black-owned businesses. And of course, during the current United States racial unrest spurred by messages on social media, American consumers sought out black-owned businesses to support. June 2020 saw record high Google searches for black-owned businesses near me, and smartphone restaurant discovery maps added features for discovering black-owned restaurants. Businesses on social media lists also saw significantly increased sales. Black-owned bookstores in particular had difficulty meeting demand. And moving on to the concept of a black Mecca. So the concept of a black Mecca, of course, Mecca being referred to the holy city and the religion of Islam and the capital of the Mecca province of Saudi Arabia, no relation. A black Mecca essentially is a city in the United States of America to which African Americans, particularly singles, professionals, and middle class families, are drawn to live due to some or all of the following factors. One, superior economic opportunities for blacks, often as assessed by the presence of a large black upper, middle, and upper class. Two, black businesses and political power in that city. 3, leading black educational institutions in that city. 4, a city's role in black history, arts, music, food, and all other cultural aspects. And lastly, number 5, harmonious black-white relations in a city. So essentially, the city of Atlanta in Georgia, well, Atlanta is the capital of the state of Georgia, has been referred to as a black Mecca since the 1970s and even to this very day. In 1971, the Ebony magazine called Atlanta the Black Mecca of the South because blacks have more, live better, accomplish more, and deal with whites more effectively than they did anywhere else in the South or even the North. Ebony illustrated as evidence of Mecca status, Atlanta high black home ownership, the Atlanta University Center, the nation's largest consortium of historically black colleges and universities. HBCUs, Atlanta Civil Rights Heritage, because Martin Luther King Jr. he was from Atlanta. And also black business ownership, black-owned restaurants, the civic leadership of the black clergy, the black fraternal organizations, the black sorority organizations, and the black political power in City Hall. While it is acknowledged the poverty, which is a large percentage of Atlanta's black populations endured. In the year 1974, Atlanta became the first major southern city to elect an African-American mayor. And ever since then, every Atlanta mayor had been African American, mostly graduates of HBCUs, to my knowledge. In 1983, Atlanta magazine said that Atlanta's reputation as a black Mecca was deserved because it is true, because the metro area now has the highest proportion of middle-income African Americans of any city in the country. A 1997 Ebony magazine article illustrated Atlanta's status as the new Mecca and the land of milk and honey for blacks, because a poll of the magazine's 100 most influential African Americans voted Atlanta overall the best city for blacks, possessed the most employment opportunities for blacks. It was America's most diverse city, and was the city with the best schools and the most affordable housing for blacks. A 2002 article in the same magazine reconfirmed Atlanta as the new black Mecca and the go-to city for blacks. In 2009, the Associated Press characterized Atlanta's status as a black Mecca by black political power in its city hall. And in 2015, a report showed that the Atlanta area had the greatest numerical gain in new black residents than any metropolitan area in the United States, according to an analysis of census data. And in 2018, getting a little bit more recent, Forbes magazine ranked Atlanta tied for the #1 city in the United States, along with the Washington, D.C. area, for where African Americans are doing the best economically. In 2019, USA Today named Atlanta the nation's black tech capital. Atlanta attracts the most black professionals in the tech industry. And as of 2020, the Atlanta Council remains majority black, which is rare for city councils in major U.S. cities. Although Atlanta's status as a Mecca for blacks is sometimes questioned, or the concept of Mecca refuted altogether, because there's still an endemic high levels of black poverty that exists alongside black success. And also in 2016, Black Enterprise then called Houston, Texas, to be the next great black business Mecca. The Houston metropolitan area boasts an accomplished and strategically networked community of African American entrepreneurs, executives, and business leaders as any city in the country. Houston also claims one of the most robust and effective business development and advocacy organizations in the country. The Greater Houston Black Chamber of Commerce, founded in 1935 as Houston's first black civic organization, and currently led by Chairwoman Courtney Johnston Rose, I think, is the go-to source for the business development and strategic partnership opportunities, as well as education, capital, and contacts for entrepreneurs. And also, the founder and CEO of the 3204 Lyons Avenue LLC, Christopher Senegal, has been a real estate investor and developer for over a decade. So essentially, that LLC has offered the opportunity to invest in a cash flowing portfolio of residential and commercial property on Lyons Avenue in Houston's historic Fifth Ward. This corridor was once a thriving black business district. Long-term residents referred it to as Black Wall Street, Houston. According to him, everything has a life cycle, including a neighborhood. What's old will eventually become reborn. And according to him, thankfully, we no longer have to sit on the sideline as our communities are gentrified. We can participate in the revitalization and persevere the heritage created by the existing residents. The majority of the tenants in this real estate portfolio are single adults and seniors that would eventually be displaced with the continued gentrification of the neighborhood. So, Chris Senegal started his business, Evictus Properties, in 2008. And then his focus is he wanted to change the narrative on gentrification through the redevelopment that balances the opportunity to attract high-income people originally from that community out of the suburbs while ensuring existing residents are not displaced in the process. In 2013, he bought a block of partially abandoned drug investor property, and then he cleaned it up. Now he is he is building 14 new construction townhomes on that property. As a real estate social media influencer and advocate, he has successfully attracted the younger black professional buyers to be homeowners in that project. The opportunity that he presented it in the past would have allowed you to invest in a historically black neighborhood that is revitalizing with or without black people. It also serves as the purpose of allowing those that have few housing options to stay in their existing homes. They can prevent from being casualties of the normal gentrification narrative. So by taking over that portfolio of property from retiring landlords, Chris Senegal is preventing it from being sold to someone whose sole intent is to remove the tenants and then build higher dollar real estate. So essentially, the offer that he had, I think he did raise the money, but the goal was to raise up $1,070,000, which was the maximum amount of money that he could raise by SEC regulations, the Security Exchange Commission that actually regulates investing, the investing world. So $70,000 was allocated towards the acquisition of the portfolio, and then the remaining funds would then be utilized as repair services, which is $25,000, as well as a cost of design improvements to the commercial property. And of course, the shareholders, they get 40% of the profit share. And of course, where I got this information from was the Buy the Block website. So it's Buy, B-U-Y, the Block, T-H-E-B-L-O-C-K, Buy the Block. And of course, also another thing, another project is also is taking place in, I think it's in New Orleans. And of course, the By the Black Boston Rouge, not the Boston Rouge, I pronounced it wrong. The By the Block was for Baton Rouge, which is in Louisiana. And Baton Rouge is the capital of Louisiana. Essentially, there's a real estate investor similar to Chris Senegal. His name is Julian Gordon. And there's also another one, Anthony. I think his last name is... Yeah, so it's Julian Gordon, and also trying to think. His last name is Anthony Kimball. So it's Anthony Kimball, Tevin Wade, and Julian Gordon. They actually have a team, and they're actually doing the same thing with a small section in Baton Rouge, and Baton Rouge is the capital of Louisiana, but they're actually going to be buying the Eddie Robinson Historic District. And of course, both opportunities on Buy the Block, it is currently closed, so they're not accepting any new investors. But of course, I can't really wait until the end result on both Houston with Chris Senegal, and of course Baton Rouge with Julian Gordon, and also Anthony Kimball and Tevin Wade. So currently the Black Mecca, or the best place for Black people to thrive in, is Atlanta, and following up is going to be Houston, because again, Chris Senegal, he actually bought a historic ward in Houston. Of course, that historic place was also called it was also a Black Wall Street historically, but it's actually much smaller as compared to Black Wall Street in Tulsa. So yeah. Also, moving on, I'm going to be closing in a little. So essentially, business ownership is powerful. It is very, 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 very powerful. And in my opinion, I think it is heavily needed in the Native Black American community today. Malcolm X said, the economic philosophy of Black nationalism only means that we should own and operate and control the economy of our community. The economic philosophy of Black nationalism only means that we have to be involved in a program of re-education to educate our people into the importance of knowing that when you spend your dollar out of the community and where you live, the community in which you spend your money becomes richer and richer, and the community out of which you take your money becomes poorer and poorer. And because of these Negroes who have been misled, misguided, and breaking their necks to take their money and spend it with the man is becoming richer and richer, and you're becoming poorer and poorer. And then what happens? The community in which you live becomes a slum. It becomes a ghetto. The conditions become run down, and then you have the audacity to complain about poor housing in a rundown community, while you're running down it yourselves when you take your dollar out. And you and I are in a double trap, because not only do we lose by taking our money someplace and spending it someplace else, when we try and spend it in our own community, we're trapped because we haven't had sense enough to set up stores and control the businesses in our community. The man who is controlling the stores in our community is a man who doesn't look like we do. He is a man who doesn't even live in our community. So you and I, even when we try and spend our money on the block where we live or the area where we live, we're spending it with a man who, when the sun goes down, takes a basket full of money in another part of town. And of course, I quoted, of course, I probably might botch it, but I've actually quoted Malcolm X, The Battle of the Bullet, from April 3rd, 1964. And of course, the black buying power was 1.4 trillion in 2019, according to Selig Center for Economic Growth. That's higher than the gross domestic product of Mexico. It is projected to grow to 1.8 trillion by the year 2024. That growth is, of course, outpacing white buying power. Between 2000 and 2018, black buying power rose 114% compared to an 89% increase in white buying power, according to Nielsen. So imagine if that $1.5 trillion of black buying power, of course, I kind of approximated for this year because, of course, it's taken off. Imagine if that 1.5 trillion of black buying power from this year is actually retained, and black people let the money circulate in their neighborhoods, meaning we black people would then buy from black-owned businesses or do business with black-owned business men and women primarily, and we take the money and then we then invest it in our neighborhoods and into our well-being. What would Black America look like within a decade if we did that? Can you imagine how wealthy we would be? Essentially, this is us picking ourselves up by the bootstraps that the right wing would want black people to do in order to be a successful community. Aside from voting for them during election cycles, which I'm not going to do anyways, because I haven't forgotten about the Compromise of 1877 and their abandonment of radical Reconstruction policies, which then led to almost 100 years of anti-black community Jim Crow racial segregation policies. Of course, if we do that, at least the economic thing, this is us using free market laissez-faire capitalism in a very creative way to empower ourselves as the black community. I mean, the political right wing, they do not want to give us reparations for slavery, Jim Crow, and the current racial policy of benign neglect. Or they don't want to sponsor or pass a congressional legislation for economic empowerment that probably won't even do with reparations at all. Or even push any sitting Republican president to draft up an economic empowerment plan executive order similar to what President Trump, a Republican and a right-winger, mind you, signed for the Asian American Pacific Islander community in May 2019. And the executive order I'm referring to is Executive Order 13872. So the right wing will want us to pick ourselves up by the bootstraps, but I don't think they really want us to do it as a collective, because as a collective, we'll be very, very, very powerful. They love individualism, but not black group success, because they claim that it's division, or it will harm black and white race relations even more. Or they're even going to claim it's going to tarnish Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy of integration, which is not the same thing as desegregation, because desegregation is the ending of the separation of people on the basis of a particular other of a particular characteristic, while integration is the next step further than desegregation and the encouragement of mixing of different subgroups of the people for the benefit for improving relations between two groups with different characteristics than each other. So essentially, just how I normally say to other people on social media who I'm friends with, the civil rights movement should have stopped at equal protection under the law, because as Black struggle against segregation, we were still being beat and murdered and lynched. So essentially, law enforcement participated in those affronts either by refusing to protect Black people or by becoming perpetrators of violence themselves. So essentially, integration led to our economic demise. The argument can be made that prior to integration, we had two-parent households. The incarceration rate was lower than it is now. We owned more businesses than we do today. We even own land way more than we do today, as compared to the 1980s and on. But the right wing will overlook that the Jewish American community, the Asian American community, the Arab American community, and the Hispanic American community pool their money and retain their money and reinvest it into the betterment of their communities and neighborhoods. And of course, I rarely see conservative white race relation commenters say those things to those other communities about them segregating themselves from the rest of society as a whole, from other ethnic groups, and not encouraging integration onto them. But we only hear that, or we always hear these talks of you're promoting racism, or you're being too divisive, or you're ruining Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy of integration. We only hear that, and by we, I'm actually talking about the Black community. Because, I mean, the right should be glad and be supportive of us having these conversations with each other, of retaining that 1.5 trillion of Black buying power amongst ourselves and letting us invest it into our communities and our well-being. Because if that's the case, it's going to make social welfare programs obsolete for Black people, which is, again, what the right wing do not want Black people to be on in the first place. Because, again, they want us to rely on free market laissez-faire capitalism. So, of course, it's not division, it's not racism, because we are discriminating against white people, or it's going to harm Black-white race relations even more, or even tarnish Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy of integration. It's actually to protect us from an economic perspective. So it's either that we practice ethno aggregation and conservative whites not complain that we are retaining our $1 trillion buying power, or they can actually draft us up an economic empowerment plan similar to Executive Order 13872, the Executive Order for Asian American and Pacific Islander Empowerment, that Republican and right-wing leaning capitalist former President Donald J. Trump has signed in May 2019. So essentially, I'm currently reading books on learning how to start my own business in order to provide employment and to reinvest the profits into growing and expanding my business, and then using some of the proceeds in order to invest it into the Native non-Hispanic Black American the non-Hispanic Black American community. So essentially, I read this book first, the Young Entrepreneur's Guide to Starting and Running a Business, Turn Your Ideas into Money by Steve Mariotti. I'm also reading this one, Start Your Own Business, by the staff of the Entrepreneur Media Incorporated. Of course, I'm also reading a Dummies book, because, you always got to throw in a Dummies book somewhere in there. Starting a Business, All in One for Dummies by Eric Tyson and Dr. Bob Nelson. And lastly, I'm reading this book, Get Your Business to Work, 7 Steps Earning More, Working Less, Living the Life You Want by George Hetley. And of course, I will probably do another video on how to start a business for all my Black audiences. If they want to, if they want to start a video, I can actually do a how-to, because of course I'm in the process of building my own business for obvious reasons, because I have these books, have this book, and have this book. Actually, this book got a little weight to it. And of course, I just finished reading this book. Yeah, so this book, and this book. Because again, black people seriously need economic empowerment, especially where the country is going, let alone the world itself, in the upcoming decades after this pandemic is all over with. So again, I'm closing out this video. This is Dawson Discussions. I'm your host, Anthony L. Dawson Jr., and I will see you in the next video. Take care and have a great rest of your day.